Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the first broad kit of Toolkits Fiction in 2020. Before we get started, I respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the custodians of the land from which I'm broadcasting to you this evening. But I'd also like to acknowledge the Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the Wajak Buja, which we often call Perth, where our guest artist, Holden Sheppard is located. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, of each of these groups, to recognise their continuing relationship with this land and with its culture as well, and to thank them for their hospitality on this unceded land. My name is Jennifer Down, if we haven't met before. I facilitate the Toolkits Fiction program through Express Media, and this evening I have the great pleasure to be joined by the wonderful Holden Sheppard. There he is. I'm mirrored, so I feel like I don't know if I'm pointing the right way at all.
I think it's right.
The other person on this screen. Holden is an award-winning writer from West Australia. His debut novel, Invisible Boys, was published by Fremantle Press last year, 2019. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And went on to win a slew of awards, including the 2019 Kathleen Mitchell Award. His novella, Poster Boy, was a winner of the Griffith Review Novella Project competition the year before in 2018. And it's actually available to read online. So if you want a sneak peek of his work, you can head just to Griffith Review and search for it. It'll come up. I highly recommend it. His fiction has also been published in the likes of the Westerly, Page 17, Indigo Journal, and the Bright Lights No City anthology of short fiction. And his non-fiction has appeared in a whole lot of places, from ABC Online to the Huffington Post to 10 Daily. Holden currently serves as the deputy chair of Writing WA, and also as an ambassador for Lifeline WA. And he's originally from Geraldton, but I understand you now live in Perth.
I do live in Perth, but it's the very far northern suburbs, so it's almost it's almost South Geraldton. A lot of people call it anyway. So
yeah, like really on the he says that he believes the best writing comes straight from the heart, unabashed, unfettered, and unafraid. And that definitely describes Invisible Boys, which I've read in a single sitting, and I don't say that as a sort of to blow smoke up his ass. I genuinely sat down, read it cover to cover, with a cup of tea, didn't move, didn't breathe. I guess I like in a bookshop maybe. I hope I breathed. Although it definitely felt like sometimes I was holding my breath. I think probably like on a bookshelf in a shop, it would be described as queer YA, but it's also like it's so much more than that. It's this beautiful coming of age story. It's incredibly tender. It's sometimes very funny. And I read it quite recently, but I know that the characters will stay with me for a long, long time. Many weeks and months to come. Thank you so much for joining us, Holden.
Thank you for having me, Jen, and thank you all for tuning in and for coming on. This should be really fun.
I think it'll be good. Before we get stuck into our conversation, a little bit of housekeeping about the program. So Toolkits is an intensive 12-week course for writers under 30, and it's run by Express Media. Now, you might know Express as the publisher of VoiceWorks magazine. You might know them as the producer of events like the Track series, or you just might know them as the go-to resource for young writers around Australia. The Toolkits program is digitally based, which means that anyone can take part anywhere in Australia, so long as you have internet access. And in this year's cohort, we have participants from Canberra to Alice Springs to Brisbane to Melbourne. But in these live broadcast weeks, we open up the class to you so that everyone can benefit from our genius guest artists. Tonight, Holden and I are going to talk a little bit about voice, both in the sense of kind of dialogue and in the sense of, I guess, perspective and point of view in fiction. If you want to ask any questions, you can do so via Twitter using the hashtag EMToolkits, that's capital E, capital M Toolkits, or I think via the Express Media Facebook page as well. And please do, we would love to hear from you, so it's not just me asking all of my questions. So Holden, I guess first things first, when one of the things that struck me the most about Invisible Boys was like, I was so glad that we had you in to talk about this topic, because you have such a gift for dialogue, and both the dialogue that's kind of between characters and then the dialogue that like the internal stuff, whether it's kind of characters berating themselves or hesitating or remembering things or kind of going to and fro on big decisions. Do you enjoy writing conversations?
I do. Conversations, I think, are my favorite part of writing fiction. And I think when I was younger, I used to love, like when I was probably a teenager, I used to love description. I used to think that was like a high level writing skill. If you could, if you could read a thesaurus and find like 7 other words for blue and use them all, like it's ultramarine or it's aqua or it's turquoise. Like, wow, cerulean. Like I used to think that was like skill. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that description has a real value, but it's through conversations and dialogue that I have a lot of fun. But also, I think there's 2 kind of key things that you get in terms of a narrative and its development. I think there's 2 key things that you get from dialogue that you probably can't get from description. I'm willing to be proved wrong by probably a billion examples in literature that will blow everything I'm about to say out of the water. But in general, I think conversations are where your characters can reveal themselves. So I like using conversation and dialogue to just unpick really organically what a character is all about. And so the way they talk, what they talk about, what they refuse to talk about, the way they put words together, all of those things reveal your character in a very organic way that feels like we're seeing them in action. So dialogue is its own form of action. Yeah. So for me, it helps you avoid kind of info dumping and saying, this character has blue eyes and is 5'7", and I'm describing myself apparently.
I was going to say, it sounds like a dating profile.
Yeah. But sometimes when you're starting out writing, you kind of go like, okay, cool, I've got to like give the dating profile of my character. And I think conversations and dialogue are a more natural way to progress your character development. But my bigger thing with conversations is tension. So I feel like tension is born and developed and resolved through dialogue. So, if humans anywhere have interactions, that's usually the way we resolve those problems. Generally speaking, the main thrust of a given novel is the tension between humans. Not always. Sometimes it's between humans and nature or whatever. But more often than not, it's between humans. So when you see, that final resolution, there's usually some form of dialogue that happens. It has to all come to a head. And it's through dialogue that happens. We stand up for ourselves, we express ourselves, we solve problems, we define ourselves. It all happens through the spoken word for me. And I think it's really important. I think tension is really important. There's an agent, a literary agent called Janet Reed over in New York. And she runs a really good blog, by the way. I recommend it to every writer. I think it's called jetread.blogspot.com, I think. But look up Janet Reed. She's a lit agent.
Write this down.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I haven't heard of her, so I'm literally taking note.
She's fantastic. Like everything I learned about publishing and agents and that kind of thing, I feel like I learned from Janet Reed. She does something called, she does her own blog, and she does something called Query Shark, which is where she'll literally.
Oh, I know Query Shark.
That's her. She runs that. But one thing she said, and it's always stuck with me, is that when she reads queries for manuscripts that are pitched to her, she's always going, there needs to be tension on every page. So when she reads the actual pages of the manuscript, she's like, tension every page. That's her motto. And I really took that to heart. And I was like, so when I wrote Invisible Boys, I was like, all killer, no filler, tension on every page. It has to keep driving forward. And I just feel like conversations and dialogue are the way that happens. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point. Like the dialogue can serve so many purposes in fiction, but one of them I think that's kind of sometimes under-recognized by writers when they're starting out is that kind of propulsive force. Like it's a way of moving things forward and of giving information, like you were saying earlier, without dumping it all, but also of like literally moving through time, and it provides this sort of pace or tempo to the plot. Yeah, and often I think that's right. It's the pacing and tempo stuff. Like it is propulsive. And what I often find, like if I'm judging like a writing comp or something like that, if I'm reading short stories or novellas,
And if there's like no dialogue or very
Yeah.
sparse dialogue, and there's not like a great stylistic reason for it, often that's a sign to me that there's not enough going on, or there's too much, there's too much describing, there's too much kind of telling and enough showing kind of thing. But as I said, I'm willing to be, there'll be billions of examples of great literature where you probably have whole novels where there's no dialogue, or, only a few lines spoken, and it's superb. But I just think as a general rule, I think.
Yeah, I agree totally. Yeah. Do you think was that knowledge something that you kind of had to come by tooth and nail, or do you you obviously really enjoy writing these conversations and thinking about, the subtext and what people don't say and things like that, but did it kind of come naturally to you, or was it something you really had to work at to develop as a writer?
I've definitely worked at it. I don't think it's innate. I think like any part of writing, I think it's probably a case of every writer has like a core kernel of whatever level of talent or skill naturally, just kind of, I don't know, it rocks up, and I don't know why it's there, but we all have some form of it. But you can develop that. So I didn't actually know I was very good at dialogue, to be honest, but I've since Invisible Boys and Poster Boy came out, I've had that's been a lot of the feedback has been people saying that, and even so, like people in the film industry and people who produce plays and things I've had coffees with people in both industries, and they're like, why don't you come write scripts for films? Why don't you come write stage plays? And I'm like, I don't know, because I write books. I don't know why. But I was thinking about this, and I come from a very big family. So I'm half Italian, and one of 6 kids, so a family of 8 growing up in Geraldton. And I think I was just always listening. There was always noise, and there were always conversations going on. So I was always just absorbing, and because I was a lot younger, I was one of the youngest kids. You didn't really have much to say when the adults and the teenagers are talking about serious stuff. So I would just listen a lot. And I think that's probably the thing I would say is like what you said, about you have to have an ear for it kind of thing. I think that comes from listening. So if there's a way to upskill in dialogue writing, I think it is probably through listening or doing things like, I remember doing things like during my writing degree, I would write, we'd be given like random writing exercises that were just wildly bizarre, and they were deliberately bizarre. But one of them was that I had to go to a cafe for 3 hours with a stuffed animal and sit there at the cafe with the stuffed animal and write about an emotion. I think it was anger. And like it didn't work. Like I could not get angry because it was just the weirdest situation.
Yeah, too self-conscious. I imagine.
But what did happen was that I was sitting in a cafe listening to all these conversations going around, and I think that's kind of the most important thing when it comes to picking up an ear for how humans speak. It's like your job is to reflect reality, so it doesn't have to be doesn't have to perfectly progress the plot. Sometimes the dialogue will take twists and turns that you don't expect. A conversation starts one way with a particular question, and maybe that question doesn't get answered, and it's because it doesn't get answered that the whole conversation goes in a different direction, and the whole book goes in a different direction. So I guess that's the kind of thing. But what I always say with dialogue as well is like, you want to be as real as you can, but without having all the ums and ahs, or there's certain parts of reflecting reality, but not going too far. Because if you did actually write how people speak, it would get incredibly frustrating.
So how do you know? I feel like I have just said this. I'm having an intense feeling of deja vu, and I feel like there is somebody who I've done feedback. We do one-on-one feedback in toolkits every second week, and I feel like I said more or less that word for word to somebody last week. So to whoever that is, I wasn't just me banging. No, how do you go about? How do you kind of know? I guess like when to pull back. When is. I guess something I wanted to ask you about, which is connected to this, maybe we can talk about them together, is in both Invisible Boys and Poster Boy, there's this incredibly strong sense of place that is delivered through the Australian vernacular. Like I instantly knew, it was so grounded in Australian speech patterns and the kind of the rhythms, and then this slang as well. But also, I never felt like I was reading like a parody, like a Crocodile Dundee. Do you know what I mean? It never ventured into that kind of parodic territory. How do you know, like, what the right amount is and when to pull back? And I guess that goes for things like ums and ahs, or, like long dramatic soliloquies that, never really happen in real life, but sometimes they go really well in a book. When do you know to like stop or pull back? Or
yeah, I think it's I guess there's two parts to that. I mean, with the the ums and ahs, monologues, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't belong. And so even though it might happen in real life, and it might even happen in your book, you don't have to present it as real-time dialogue. So that took me like a really long time to learn, by the way. Like I used to, and not just with dialogue, but with everything, I used to be like, well, my characters are inside and the next scene is outside. And so I'd have to show them like getting up and leaving.
Yes.
And then walking down the corridor, then leaving the foyer, and then going outside, and then the scene can start. And I was a fairly accomplished writer, but I was still doing stuff like that because I couldn't just get okay, we cut there, we start here. And same thing, like you can cut out the hellos and goodbyes, the waking up, the pleasantries that are of no use to your reader or your plot or your characterization. If that doesn't serve a function in terms of the narrative development, then I would cut it. Monologues, I guess, same thing. There's really long, florid kind of things that we sometimes might put in a book because it seems good, but I'll often do that in internal monologue. The character will think those things, but they won't necessarily say it, because if they said it, I don't know if anyone would let them finish.
Yeah, well, like that's what I always say, that like it sometimes you think it works in a first draft, but I bang on a lot about reading work aloud. And I think if it doesn't work when you read it aloud, dialogue especially is like a killer, because and it's that same thing. If you can't say a sentence without taking a breath, or if you can't, if it's a whole chunk of text, and in real life you couldn't say that without your mum or dad or partner or best friend or whoever being like, hold on a second, like
and hang on, that's not what I meant. Like there would be an interjection somewhere.
Exactly. Even if the interjection is like, shut up, I need you to stop, it's no, I totally agree. So and I often find even having written dialogue that people seem to think is decent and having been edited heavily, I'll still get to the point where I'll get up and do a reading from Invisible Boys at Perth Festival or any festival, and I'll get there, and as I read it I go, oh, I'm not reading that line, so I'll just change it as I go, because it just doesn't sound right, the written word and the spoken word are just two different things. Sorry, you had a bigger question around the Aussie vernacular stuff. Well, just as an example, like using that as a kind of springboard for your approach to dialogue generally, I guess.
I guess my thing was I wanted to reflect the reality of the world I saw around me and the setting that this book is set in. Geraldton, Midwest of Western Australia. Australians generally, we talk like, we have our kind of, there's a little bit of bogan in all of us, even if we're not super bogan, you know what I mean? Yeah. And I think even more so when you're from a working class background, as I am, even more so when you're from a country background, as I am. So when you add in all those factors, of course your characters are going to speak like this. My thing is like, it wasn't a parody, as you said. Like I wasn't trying to pull the piss. I wasn't trying to create like this super Aussie culture that maybe once existed, or using words that aren't really used anymore. Like as you say, like everyone there was getting there saying "struth," "crikey." Like you'd just be like, this isn't how people talk in 2020. No one talks like that anymore, or very few people do. And so I was just trying to be real, and I feel like I stuck to that as much as I could. Like it was Aussie without being. I wasn't trying to kind of make a thing of it being Aussie. It's just circumstance.
No, it was that was one of the things that like there was in the first few pages. Sorry, I actually wrote it down. Did you say lackey or lacquer band? I think you said lackey bands.
Lackey band, yeah.
Sorry, in my family we said lacquer bands, but like same thing. And it was the first. Yeah, it's that great East-West divide coming out. No, it was the first time I think that I've ever read that in a book. which is so funny because it's like I don't remember. I've got one in my desk drawer. I don't remember the time that I have called this an elastic band.
Yeah.
But it's always a lacquer band. And yet I've never read that in a book. And I had this beautiful moment. It was like literally in the first chapter, I think. I had this beautiful moment of being like, oh, like it really touched me in some strange way, even though it was like kind of a throwaway line in the book itself. Because we don't necessarily, I think representations of particularly rural and or working class Australian backgrounds, if people don't have experience of living those things, it's really tough to get right, and it's quite easy to kind of make a mockery of, even if that's not the intention.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's so many words like that, like lucky band as an example, but whatever.
Yeah.
That there's differences across the country even.
Yes.
I remember when I wrote Poster Boy, and the editor at Griffith Review was giving his notes to me, and he comes back and he's like, what is cool drink? Like, that's wrong. It should be fizzy drink. And I was like, no, we all say cool drink, don't we? Yeah. And then I kind of had to go on Twitter, and I was like, WA people, do we say cool drink? Is that a thing? Is that old fashioned? Yeah. But that's all we've ever called it. And it was really interesting to see, like, there's just so many differences. But I wanted to reflect, like, this is how WA people in Geraldton in that particular time and place speak. And it's, so I kind of feel a bit of pride in that, like a bit of bogan pride maybe, but it wasn't, it was just me wanting to reflect who I am, who my characters are. And I come from the kind of background where, like, Kath and Kim, for example, when that was on TV, I never clicked that it was in any way or a parody of anything. Yeah. I was literally sitting in my uni class, like, years after Kath and Kim was on TV, and the lecturers, and how Kath and Kim kind of satirized the Aussie bogan. I was like, what? It completely threw me, because I was like, these are the people I know. I know all those people,
And I think it's like, it's interesting because I just think it's really hard to kind of walk that line between writing something that's authentic, and then, as you were saying before, the way we speak isn't actually, like, it doesn't quite translate to the page, because there are all of these slippages of meaning and things like that. And so there are words like I don't know, I can't think of an example. Oh, like maybe like sometimes I'm not convinced when I see people I'm not talking about your work, or I use this word, whatever, but sometimes I'll see mate written in Australian fiction, and I just know that the author has never used that word. I know that the author has never, like, referred to one of their mates as a mate, and it's like it something kind of jars, and it's not like they're not allowed to use this word or that word or whatever, but it's about, like, this sort of, I know that the author isn't comfortable with using that vernacular, in the same way as, I don't know, there's a whole lot of registers or whatever that I wouldn't necessarily be comfortable using. And so I think it's about, maybe it's to do with, like, doing the research as well, like, in the same way as when we, I don't know, when you first go to TAFE or uni, and you have to, or even, like, I guess in high school, the first time you write a more academic essay, there are these, like, set phrases that you learn to use. Like, it can be seen that, and, consequently, and then over time, and then over time, those phrases, like, stop being things that you need to remember to use, and they just become a part of your repertoire. And I think any voice, like, that's a really mechanical way of talking about it. But I think if you're a writer who has trouble with dialogue, or writing, conversations, or kind of those inner reflective things, I think that's a really good thing to remember, is that, it's great to have an ear for it, but also you can develop it too. It's like a muscle that you can build up.
It totally is. And I think it's, if you're coming from that authentic background, it's a lot easier. And if you're writing outside of that experience, then it becomes harder. But it's still something you can develop for sure.
Yeah.
And something I had to be conscious of as well, because I was writing teenagers, right? And I really didn't want to put in like current teenage slang, because I'm not a teenager anymore, obviously. And I didn't want to get there, have my characters being like, yeah, it's like, I don't know, it's lit or whatever. Like, I don't even know if that's probably already dated, right? But you know, like, there's so many things I was like, one, it will date the book straight away. If people read this in 5 years, they'll be like, oh, that's when that was set, obviously.
Yes.
But it just wasn't authentic. Like, it's not something I would say. And so I had to kind of think more. So I deliberately didn't put it in. So there's very little current teen slang in there. What I had to think about was more like behaviors. So like, what are teenagers doing now? You know, like how are they interacting now? So using technology and things like that. Teenagers have always been irreverent. Teenagers have always used slang. Teenagers have always used swear words a lot. Teenagers have always been inappropriate. And that's consistent through every generation. So if I can channel that, and I can channel what it felt like for me being a teenager, then it doesn't matter if I'm using the right words for 2018, 2019, because in 2 years that'll be irrelevant, you know. And
like it's kind of like that thing where, you know, we know the music that our parents' generation listened to. Like, you know what I mean? Like, like the younger generations all have a memory of the language that was used, you know, for like pretty much the past 80 years or whatever our reference point is. So it's like, I mean, I'm not that old. Well, thank God. No, I'm kidding. This is for under 30s. No, I want to come back to that topic in a second, but just before I forget, we've got a couple of questions that have come through. One of them from Zoe, who's one of our participants in Toolkits this year. And she's asked, when writing a book within a culture or an era potentially different from the audience, who should your dialogue look to connect more with?
Interesting question, which is my way of delaying answering a question till I've thought.
Yeah, that's like, I feel like there's a whole thesis in that. That's a really good question.
There is. I guess part of this ties into the whole the own voices thing. And partly not, I guess. Well, it's not writing different from my own experiences. It's writing from something that's just different from the audience, right? So I'm just rereading the question because I can see it now.
Oh, I'm glad. I was going to say some BTS for you all.
Yeah, within a cultural era, potentially different from the audience, but not different from you. Okay, sorry. So that's not really own voices.
Yeah, it could be something as simple as like you're writing a book set in, I don't know, you're writing a book set in the 1800s, but obviously reading it now, I guess.
Yeah, I think, look, for me, the kind of the structural integrity and authenticity of the artistic work is probably the more paramount thing. So if I'm writing about what I'm writing about, which is teenage boys in Geraldton in that era who are gay or homosexual or whatever, it's about them. So it needs to reflect. For me, I reflect reality, and that's what I kind of seek to do. Other writers I know, and this is a perfectly valid approach as well, is they'll go, look, I want to write a world, e.g., where there's no homophobia and, being gay is normalized and that's not an issue in this world. That's totally a valid approach as well. And in that world, you would then try to change that for what your audience is wanting, which is a happy gay novel. And that's something that I actually had in response to this book was when my agent was first pitching it, was publishers kind of coming back and saying, oh, well, this is dark. We only want happy gay stories now. And I was enraged by that because there's totally a place for happy gay stories. We need those. Yeah. But there's also a place for like real life and how things really play out sometimes. And real life is not always happy. So I guess my answer to Zoe's question in a roundabout way is that I feel for me, my approach would be I honor the work first and I honor my own voice first. And I think about what do I have to say? What do these characters have to say? What is organically important for this story to be doing? That is first and foremost. I then put it out in the world. If an audience hates it, then that sucks for me and it sucks for my sales. But I have serviced the need to tell a story that was real. And that's what drives me in all my storytelling is to tell realist fiction. So for me, that would be that choice. I'm not saying you don't have to think about the market and you don't have to think about the audience, because of course you do. But for me, I'd be driven by accuracy and authenticity first and foremost.
I also think, like, just to kind of piggyback on that, you have to, like, kind of honor your audience. And this isn't at all separate from what you were saying about the integrity of the work itself. In fact, I think they go hand in hand, right? Because it's like you have to. I always feel like when I write, I have to write for the harshest possible critic, right? And so I have to write in all senses of the word. I have to write for the person who is the most critical of dialogue, who is the most critical of my pacing and plotting, who is looking out for repetition. And when I'm writing, it's like almost my editing process is thinking how, like, it's that thing about, like, nobody is harsher on yourself than you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that,
Yeah.
I think it's good to hold yourself to the same standards when it comes to, like, ethical questions, which this Zoe's question doesn't necessarily pertain to own voices narratives, but I think that's also an important thing, is, like, have I done my due diligence in approaching this voice or this topic or whatever it is with the respect that I hope would be accorded me if I were in that situation. And, not speaking for somebody, but, including people in a conversation without kind of making assumptions about them or making generalizations or speaking over the top of them or whatever it is. And so I think when you consider an audience, that's sometimes a good thing. You can, that's how I like to approach it, is to just kind of, it's good to hold yourself to the highest standards you can imagine. And then beyond that.
Absolutely. And something I thought of while as you were saying that, something you said, I don't know what it was, reminded me, I think speaking outside of your experience or something. But I was thinking about, more literally, I was thinking for Zoe's question, something like Invisible Boys, right, going to, like, an American audience, which is probably a much more literal answer that I could have given. Like, I could have written this book very differently. I could have set this book in Texas, or I could have just set it in a nondescript town and kind of very generic language use. But I deliberately chose to make it Australian. And my feeling is that there are a whole range of hesitations around, like, when Aussie works go to the US, they get translated,
Yes.
And there's hesitations around those kind of things. But I don't want to incorporate. I don't want to take those on because I feel like they're a little bit bullshit. And I know they happen and it's part of the market, and I totally get that. But I don't want to feed into this idea that American audiences are too stupid to understand when an Australian speaks, because I understand when Americans speak, whether I don't get.
Exactly.
And I can use context clues to work out what they mean by their slang or by their cultural references. And it's a disservice to international audiences to say that, or to assume that they can't.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Language, right? Like, we're speaking English.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I always feel like, when I was a kid, if I didn't know what a word meant, I would, like, ask somebody or look it up in a dictionary. And this was like I got the internet when I was 7. I'm showing my age here. So, like, there were a couple of years when I couldn't just go online and, like, look stuff up. But I think, like, as you said, like, context is a lot, or context helps a lot. And there are so few words that, like, I've got, several friends who are American. I've spent a little bit of time there, and there are so few times when you're actually in conversation and they'll be like, wait, what does XYZ, like, whinge or, like, buzzies or whatever it is, like, they're gonna get it eventually. And I think you're right. It kind of undersells international readers' intelligence or ability to deduce that stuff.
It really does. I just remembered when you're talking about your examples of American, like, examples in conversation. There was a great one when I was backpacking when I was 18, and there was an American I was chatting with in a hostel, and someone was telling a story about how they were so pissed. They were pissed, and so obviously they couldn't drive. And this American chick just goes, "Hold on, you were so mad that you couldn't drive." And, like, it just blew her mind. And I thought that's just a great example of, like, we think that that's really universal, and that's really not.
Yeah,
really
yeah,
Aussie.
totally. Yeah, there are so many just like little slippages of meaning. Ugh. We have another question from Twitter.
Okay.
When writing younger teenage cis male characters, how do you reconcile wanting to have an authentic character voice while also not wanting to write a lot of the awful stuff that teen boys say?
Well, I think I kind of lean into the awful stuff, to be honest,
Yeah, I was
because
gonna say, I feel like you don't kind of eschew it.
no, not at all. Because and this comes back to, well, it doesn't come back to anything because I haven't said this yet in this interview. But I like to treat my characters as whole, and I like to. So I'm a big fan of, like, Jungian psychology and shadow work, right? Where and for my characters, that means that I don't just show their persona and their good side, but I like to show their shadow and their darker side that they don't like to show, or that they think is bad, or that is bad, kind of objectively. So I don't shy away from the awful stuff that teenage boys say, because teenage boys can be amazing and energetic and kinetic and aspirational, and they can also be fucking rude and obnoxious and belittling of other people. And we could say the same of teenage girls, or any group. Do you know what I mean? Like every group has its
Adults as well.
Sorry?
Adults as well, I would say.
Yeah, like absolutely. Yeah. Like any group has good and bad, light and dark. So I leaned into that, and I guess it's just a reflection of like the way I like to operate with my characters, and the way I write, and the way I generally am as a person, is that I'm okay with sometimes characters will be like Hammer in the book. Hammer is, a lot of people read and go, Hammer's such a dick. And I'm like, well, yeah, he kind of is. And that is what it is. I mean, you've got a really hot, popular teenage boy who's a footy star, and he's athletic, and so he's got all this messaging saying he's amazing. So yeah, he is kind of full of himself, but he's also damaged, and he's also soft underneath that, and he's also all these other things. So I really like to write characters that are unlikable sometimes, but also I want the audience to feel like they deserve love, and they deserve compassion, and they just deserve to be seen. So that's what I do. So I really, I guess, in answer to that question, I don't reconcile it. I reconcile it by just leaning into it and accepting that teenage boys say awful things. They also say some nice things. Teenage girls say awful things. They also say some nice things. And so that's just a way of being kind of whole about the whole process.
So, like, I guess springboarding off that question, how do you kind of how do you distinguish, or ask the audience to distinguish between, like, this character is awful and says XYZ versus this author is awful and says XYZ? You know, like, do you have any concern that when you're writing from the perspective of a character like Hammer, for example, that people will be like, well, if the character thinks this, then Holden must think this too?
Yeah. I mean, generally, it's within the context of the other character's reactions to what that character does that you can kind of give a little bit of a clue as to whether you are, as the author, on board with that, or whether you are in some way critical of it. So for Hammer, for instance, you have Hammer talking with Zeke at one point and saying, like, no, I know I'm a bad person. Like he's kind of acknowledging, like I know I am. It, like, everyone wants to root me, and it's made me really up myself. And things like he has a go, like, he's cruel to everyone, really. He's cruel to his teacher. I feel like I don't know. I feel like I trust my audience enough to know that I'm not kind of advocating for being shit to your relief teacher. Like, you can kind of see what he's doing, and from his perspective, it's really funny, and he never even learns her name, and it's just like one funny fake name after the next that he can give her. And but I think there's enough. I don't know. I think there's enough distance between that voice and that behavior versus maybe how seriously his dark side is taken, that you kind of get to know that me as the author, I'm not uncritically saying, I hate relief teachers, or I like to, call, girls at school fat and shame them. That's certainly not something I'm as the author doing, but it's something the character is doing that. And And he does feel, some level of remorse after, not a great level, but some level.
No, I think it's like interesting because it wasn't as though I came away from the book thinking, oh, this character isn't a very nice person, so Holden must be terrible as well. But it is this tricky balance sometimes. Like, I know I've definitely written, I wrote a story, it's in my second collection that deals with, like, I don't know, we all throw around the phrase toxic masculinity a lot, but deals with a group of boys growing up in sort of rural Victoria in quite impoverished circumstances, and the violence they perpetrate on young women is, like, highly sexualized. And on one hand, I wrote it because that stuff happens, and because none of it was like a stretch for me to write or to imagine, even though I myself have never been, an adolescent boy in Swan Hill or whatever. But on the other hand, I definitely had this moment when when the book was published, and I felt like people were quite surprised. Like, that story always gets a lot of questions from people.
All right.
And like, they're surprised that I could write something that horrific or that violent or something. And I do think it's interesting. Like, I remember I had this moment after it came out, and I done a couple of interviews or whatever about it, where I thought, like, oh, do they think that as a writer have to have had these experiences, for you to write about every single one? And like you say, you have to kind of trust that the reader is able to distinguish between, the author and the story. But I think also that what you said about enabling a character's actions to be seen through how other people respond to them, I think that's really telling as well. Like, I think that's how we come to sort of sympathize in a way with Hammer, is because we see his actions and, his behavior and its consequences, but then we also see what's going on with him personally. So he's humanized. He's not just this like faceless bully.
Yeah, I think it's the thing with him. He's humanized in, you see his damage, and initially, so in the second or third draft of Invisible Boys, I had a scene at the very end, or almost the very end. It was about chapter 25 or something, and it was the only scene, and it didn't belong. It got cut, but it was the only scene from Hannah's perspective, as in the handmaid Charlie, and so you had Hannah seeing Hammer. Their names are way too similar. But you had Hannah, packing her stuff into the back of the car, back of Rocky's car, kind of thing, after they've done their set at the wedding. And Hammer's walking out, and she has this moment where she's going, look at him. He's this entitled, like, privileged footy jock. He thinks he owns the world, and he kind of does in a town like this. But, like, he has no idea what it's like to be me, Hannah. He has no idea how it feels to have gone through what I've been through, to have felt the damage that he's done to me, to feel the stuff that people do to me. And it was a moment of kind of validating how she feels, even though she comes across as a bit of a bitch, to be honest. But it was validating how she feels and what she's gone through, but also pointing out that when you look at someone like Hammer, and this is not just in my book, but in general, it's very easy to make assumptions about, oh, well, that person has it fine, well, that person is like this, and they can't possibly understand what it's like to be human and to suffer and to feel pain. And actually, everyone can. Everyone's gone through that, and everyone has their shit. So I tried to express that, but that particular scene didn't make the cut, unfortunately. But I can
picture it. Like, having just read this very recently, I can kind of see why it might not have worked, but I also, there's like a little part of me that would like it as a bonus chapter. Sorry, we have
we have a bunch of questions, I think.
I know, it's great. Holden, do you have some examples of work that you think have really great dialogue?
Let me look at my stack here. People I think do really good dialogue. Bret Easton Ellis does really cool dialogue. Very like sharp, nihilistic, I'm too cool, I'm too aloof, but it's very distinctive. I really love John Marsden, the way he does dialogue. the way, like the Tomorrow series, for example, the way it was so, like, that was YA, and he was nowhere near being a young adult when he wrote that.
Yes.
But he just, and again, he's a teacher, and I think he's a principal of his own school now. So he lives and works around teenagers all the time. So he imbibes how they speak. So John Marsden is a great example of how like authentic teen dialogue. More recently, I guess, like Aussie YA, things like Alicia Tuckerman's If I Tell You, which is like a lesbian, rural kind of coming of age story. Stone Girl by Eleni Hale does that really well. Really great dialogue, and it's a dark book, but they're great examples. That something called No Worries as well by Bill Condon, came out of UQP maybe 15 years ago. But I read it, and it was a very like it's about a straight teenage boy, but it's very masculine, and it's very I just related to it because it kind of had a teenage boy in a work setting, like working in a warehouse of a supermarket, and that was my first job. I read it and just remember thinking, oh, this is exactly how everyone used to talk, and this is, like, it was just very real for me. So those are a few examples, I guess.
No, that's good. It's really like that first time you recognize yourself in a book is so, or in any media actually. Like, I know we're here to talk about writing, but it could be TV or movies or whatever. This is the first time that you see somebody like you, whether it's like for class reasons or like sexuality or like your gender is represented in a way you haven't seen it before. It's so like there's something so powerful about that.
Oh, like life-changing, like something like Loaded by Christos Tsiolkas when I read that, or Holding the Man by Timothy Conograve. Just when I read them, I don't know if I cried with Loaded. I definitely cried with Holding the Man because it's really sad. But both books just completely shook me because there I was. It wasn't exactly me, but it was close enough for the first time in my life that I was seeing someone kind of like me. And it was just such a spin out and such a validating feeling that I exist, Yeah,
and that your story is important enough to tell or, to be read.
Yeah, absolutely.
Somebody has asked, considering your next book, which you had mentioned is shifting away from YA to adult, do you think your voice will change, narrative voice we're talking about, and will the reader pick up on it?
I said, well, my voice will drop.
And his voice will drop 2 octaves.
Thank you, Grant, for the question. I know who that is. Do I think my voice will change and then will the reader pick up on it? No. So I'm about 33,000 words into the new book that I'm writing now. I've got a second book written and needing editing, and this is the third book. So this book is for adults, and honestly, the voice is like very, very close to Invisible Boys and Poster Boy, probably the same in a lot of ways. The way I write and the way I tell stories is pretty much the same, and I think it's going to be the unique thing that kind of bridges the gap between my YA work and my adult work. To be honest, a lot of people have questioned Invisible Boys being classed as YA because, yes, the characters are teenage, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it's maybe targeted to teenage readers. So I don't feel like there's a shift at all. I don't feel like my voice has changed. I feel like with Invisible Boys, I found my voice, and that's going to be with me throughout my career. The stories will change, but essentially it's always going to be a similar kind of realist approach. Look, I've got 5 words. This sums up my voice. Someone asked me once in an interview, and I love it. So they said, well, like, what are 5 words that would sum up your voice? And I'm going to remember the words now. There was raw, muscular, unfettered, punk, exorcism. And that's just like every time I look at something I've written, I'm like, yep, it's pretty much what I was trying to do. Maybe Invisible Boys was like an exorcism. Not everything I do. No, actually, yeah, no. I was thinking about this new book, and I thought, no, I'm exercising some demons with this one as well. So yeah.
That's all writing, isn't it? Like, it's just at some point, even if it's not, autofiction or whatever, it's just like this great vomiting up of emotion. And I guess that's kind of an exercise.
Yeah, I agree.
The next question is, how do you balance trying to make dialogue sound authentic? We covered this a little bit earlier on, but if you're just joining us, we're talking about how to make dialogue sound authentic without going over the top with things like, stuttering or speech pauses or repetition. Like when we speak naturally a lot, you and I have both done it tonight, I'm sure. We sort of start off saying one thing and then redirect ourselves midway or cut ourselves off and we realize we're saying something stupid or whatever it is. How do you kind of make dialogue sound natural without replicating that?
I think it's important to not replicate that because, as you've just said, real verbal speech often doesn't have punctuation and it doesn't have sentences that end, at least not any time when they should end.
Yeah.
So I guess just to very briefly recap, because we, as you said, we touched on it a little bit, but it is important to not include all the kind of pleasantries, hello, goodbye, how are you? Sometimes I'll do things like if someone says, I love you, and like in my life, if I tell someone I love them, I'm like, well, I'll say, like, I want to hear I love you back. In a story, it doesn't always have to happen. Like you don't always have to have those perfect kind of, good night, I love you too. It doesn't always have to be perfectly tied up. You can cut a scene when a conversation's almost finished but not quite finished. Or you can sum up sometimes. So you can say, like we talk about XYZ for 10 minutes and then he finally asks the question, are you going to tell so-and-so about the secret? I don't know, whatever. But you can summarize certain parts. The other thing I think I don't know if I did talk about, but the other thing I'd thought of around dialogue is not just the ums and ahs, which you want them to be indicative of like a character's quirks, right? So like if you had every single character going you'd be like, oh, for fuck's sake, like just spit it out. But if you have every character more or less speaking normally, and then you have one character who's always umming and ahhing, or who's always saying sorry before they finish a sentence, or like that tells you something about the character. So if you can use those natural, realistic elements of speech for a strategic reason to develop your character, then I feel like that's a good use of it. And the other thing I was going to say to avoid is accents. I don't know if I said that before.
You didn't. But that's a good one to mention.
Yeah, right. Like, I don't know about you, but when I read anything with accents in it, like when I was a kid, I remember reading Harry Potter and Hagrid's voice, and I was like, ugh! Like it was so. I was like, what is he saying? It was really, and it wasn't that it was hard to decipher. It just makes you stop in your tracks when someone's words are written so significantly differently. And so that's something that is best done sparingly. And it might be easy to say that they have the accent without actually trying to inflect the accent.
It's like now we live in this world where without making this like a first year sociology lecture, like we all know what an American accent sounds like versus an Irish accent versus a Singapore English accent versus whatever. And so actually just saying, she's, whatever character spoke with a heavy German accent, we can kind of all get that. And that is a lot less disruptive. Like it goes back to that idea about trusting your reader. Like we can all get that. Whereas, as you say, it's quite disruptive to read. Like if you're reading a French accent and the author has chosen to write like ZE for the, it's just like, it's a minefield of it slows you down, it trips you up. And you're right, like you're talking about Hagrid, it kind of makes you start to resent the text a little bit because you're like, God damn, I just want to know what they're saying, like get to the point. Yeah.
And you can do it sparingly, right? Like you can do like the occasional ze, or you can have them do one or two words in French, or you can have them like occasionally make a grammatical error in their speech that indicates that they're a native speaker of a language. That's fine, but if you do it every single time they speak, it gets so frustrating so quickly, and it's not a good move for dialogue.
I was going to say the way that you wrote Zeke's mum is like a really great example in Invisible Boys. Like she'll throw in the occasional Italian word, or there are certain speech patterns that she has that felt like recognizably not Anglo to me. Like I could place them, but also I didn't feel like she was this like, hey, it's a me, a Mario, I'm making a meatball. You know, it was like it never became a parody, which seems to be a theme of our conversation.
It
was
does.
just like a part of her character and identity without being the linchpin of her as a minor or background character.
No, I think it's a great observation.
We are unfortunately running out of time for our live broadcast tonight. Thank you all. I know. That was good. Thank you everybody for submitting your questions. Thank you again, Holden, for joining us, of course. Everyone who is watching, please check out Invisible Boys if you haven't. It's such a beautiful book, and it's a great time to support your local bookshop. There it is. Sorry, she said the wrong way. It's a good time to support your local bookshop, especially if you are somebody in isolation right now, as many of us are. So I guess that's a wrap on our very first live session for this year's Toolkits Fiction program. This session will be available on YouTube, I guess, in perpetuity. That's not a good thought. If you would like to revisit any of tonight's discussion, any of our scintillating commentary. And tomorrow night, you can actually tune in to the Toolkits memoir broadcast, same time, same place, different link, I guess, where Zoya Patel, who facilitates the memoir program, we'll be chatting with Amra Pjalic, I believe, about the body, although I need to check my notes. But yeah, absolutely tune in if you have any interest in memoir writing or autofiction. Thank you again, Holden.
Thank you so much, Jen. This was a really fun chat, and it just kind of took on a life of its own. Really, we just had a great conversation, which I love. And thank you to everyone who watched and who joined in and asked questions. Really appreciate it.
Have a good night, everyone.
Cheers.